Oxford University, with its 800-year legacy, had never witnessed such an unsettling silence. Moments earlier, Professor Edmund Harrington had declared with chilling certainty, "Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization." The words echoed through the Sheldonian theater as 500 scholars held their breath. At the front row, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, slowly rose from his seat. No one in that hall could have imagined that his next 10 minutes would not only go viral across the globe, but also mark the downfall of Harrington's career. That March afternoon, the theater had been packed for what was supposed to be a routine lecture on global leadership in the 21st century. The program featured world leaders and renowned academics. Dressed in a simple dark suit, Traoré had listened quietly, taking notes as speaker after speaker delivered their perspectives on democracy, development, and international cooperation. At precisely 3:30 p.m., Professor Harrington took the stage. In his late 60s, with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried the air of an authority shaped by decades of scholarship. His credentials were impeccable Rhodes Scholar, author of 12 books, recipient of 3 honorary doctorates. The introduction was glowing, the applause respectful. His lecture began confidently, almost dismissively. "When we examine the pillars of human advancement," Harrington declared, his voice reverberating through the hall, "a clear pattern emerges. Mathematics from Greece, law from Rome, philosophy from Germany, industrial innovation from Britain." He paused, scanning the audience with practiced authority. "The very foundations of civilization are indisputably Western in origin." A ripple of discomfort passed through the room, but Harrington pressed on, emboldened by the prestige of Oxford's walls. 20 minutes in, he delivered the words that would haunt him forever. "No, some may ask about other continents. Asia gave us gunpowder and paper. The Americas developed sophisticated calendars. But Africa," he paused, smirking, "I challenge anyone here to name a single significant contribution to human civilization from sub-Saharan Africa. The continent has been a recipient of civilization, not a contributor to it." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. In the front row, Ibrahim Traoré closed his notebook with deliberate calm, placed his pen neatly on the desk, and looked up. Around him, African students and scholars sat frozen, caught between outrage and the fear of confronting one of Oxford's most celebrated professors. The moment stretched unbearably. Then, slowly, Traoré raised his hand. "Yes?" Harrington asked, his irritation barely hidden. Traoré rose to his feet, tall and composed. His voice, though unamplified, carried effortlessly through the hall. "Professor Harrington," he began evenly, "I would like to respond to your assertion, if I may." Harrington's smirk widened. "By all means," Harrington said, his tone laced with condescension. He pretended not to know who the man before him was, though Ibrahim Traoré had been introduced at the start of the event. "Traoré," came the calm reply. "Ibrahim Traoré, and I accept your challenge." A ripple of anticipation ran through the audience. Several phones were raised discreetly, their owners sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Harrington gestured dismissively toward the stage. "Please, enlighten us. But do try to stick to historical facts, not romantic nationalism." The sneer in his voice was unmistakable. With steady, deliberate steps, Traoré walked to the podium, carrying a simple leather folder. He set it carefully on the lectern, then paused. His gaze swept across the packed theater before locking onto Harrington. "Professor," he began evenly, "before I respond to your challenge, may I ask you something? In your extensive research, have you ever examined the manuscript libraries of Timbuktu, studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people, considered the metallurgical techniques of the Haya of Tanzania?" Harrington waved his hand with theatrical disdain. "Ancient mud huts and primitive folklore hardly qualify as civilization, Mr. Traoré. We are speaking of true contributions to human advancement, not anthropological curiosities." A gasp rippled through the hall at the blatant disrespect. Yet Traoré remained composed. He opened his folder and lifted a single document. "Then let us begin with something you might recognize," he said, holding up a photocopy. "This is a page from the Lebombo bone, discovered in Swaziland. It is 44,000 years old, and it contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history. 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles, Mathematics, Professor, did not begin in Greece. It began in Africa. The smirk on Harrington's face faltered. He scoffed quickly, trying to recover. Counting scratches is hardly Pythagoras. Without missing a beat, Traoré produced another document. Then perhaps we should discuss the Ashango bone, from the Democratic Republic of Congo. 20,000 years old, it demonstrates knowledge of prime numbers, multiplication, and division, predating Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years. He let the weight of the numbers hang in the air before continuing, his voice still calm but gathering force. But if you prefer more recent history, let us turn to the University of Sankore in Timbuktu, home to 700,000 manuscripts and 25,000 students in the 12th century, when Oxford was still little more than a scattering of drinking halls. The hall was now utterly silent, every ear straining for his words. You credit Rome with the invention of law. Then let us speak of the Constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy, which established checks and balances 3 centuries before the American Constitution. Or the Buganda Parliament in East Africa, with its sophisticated system of governance, while Europe remained under the grip of absolute monarchs. He turned slightly, eyes never leaving Harrington. And you claim philosophy as a gift of Germany. Have you studied the writings of Zara Yaqub, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher, who developed principles of rational inquiry and human rights decades before the European Enlightenment? Or his student, Walda Haywat, whose ethical treatises rival anything produced in Europe at the time? But of course, his voice dipped laced with quiet irony. They wrote in Jose, not Latin. So perhaps, to you, that disqualifies them. Harrington tried to cut in. These are isolated. But Traoré raised his hand. The simple gesture silenced even the professor. Isolated. Traoré's voice cut through the silence, calm but edged with steel. Professor, let me tell you about isolation. Isolation is when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, housed the world's knowledge, while the ancestors of Oxford's founders still lived in mud huts. It is when African mathematicians calculated the circumference of the earth, while Europeans insisted it was flat. He straightened, his voice rising for the first time. You want contributions to civilization. Let us speak of medicine. The first successful cataract surgery was performed in Mali in the 14th century. The first caesarean section, where both mother and child survived, was carried out in Uganda in 1879. Using antiseptic techniques Europe would not adopt for another 50 years. And as for vaccination, not Jenner's cowpox. Long before that, West Africans practiced variolation against smallpox, knowledge carried to America by enslaved Africans. A murmur spread across the hall. Traoré opened another page from his folder. Architecture. The Great Zimbabwe, with its flawless acoustics, still surpasses modern engineering. The Nubian pyramids, older than their Egyptian counterparts. The rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, carved from single blocks of volcanic stone, executed with a precision modern engineers still struggle to explain. But perhaps you have never heard of these. His eyes narrowed slightly, because they do not fit your narrative of African primitiveness. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely. Students sat bolt upright, pens scratching furiously. Professors who had smirked moments ago now looked uneasy, or enlightened. Harrington's face, once smug, had hardened into something closer to panic. But Traoré pressed on, his voice carrying with unshakable authority. Metallurgy. The Haya people of Tanzania were producing carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago, a technology Europe would not achieve until the Industrial Revolution. The Benin bronzes, so sophisticated that when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans made them, inventing lies about lost Portuguese craftsmen. He turned another page. Agriculture. It was Africans who domesticated pearl millet, sorghum, African rice, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, okra. Africans who engineered irrigation systems in the Sahel capable of sustaining cities of hundreds of thousands. While Europe languished in its dark ages, the Dogon people's terraced farming has thrived for over 1,000 years in lands where European farming collapses within a single season. He paused. The theater was silent enough to hear a breath drop. Harrington, though seated, seemed to shrink under the weight of every word. And perhaps most importantly, Professor, let us speak of philosophy. Traoré's tone softened, but its intensity sharpened like a blade. Ubuntu, the belief that I am because we are. While Europe exalted conquest and individual supremacy, Africa developed systems of restorative justice, collective responsibility, and human dignity. Principles the so-called civilized world is only now beginning to rediscover. Then he leaned forward, his words slow, deliberate, and devastating. The tragedy, Professor Harrington, is not that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries erasing, ignoring, and belittling those contributions. When Timbuktu's libraries held more books than any European university, your ancestors called us illiterate. When our astronomers charted the stars, you called us superstitious. When our healers performed advanced surgeries, you dismissed them as witch doctors. The silence in the hall was no longer the silence of submission. It was the silence of a reckoning. Traoré lifted his folder once more and drew out a final document. This, Professor, is a letter from Cecil Rhodes, the very founder of the scholarship that may have funded your own education. In it, he states explicitly that African history must be suppressed in order to justify colonization. Your ignorance, Professor, is not an accident. It is the result of a deliberate, systematic effort to erase Africa's contributions to human civilization, and for 47 years, you have helped perpetuate that lie. The silence in the theater was suffocating. Harrington, standing rigid at the side of the stage, opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His authority, so carefully built over decades, was crumbling before 500 witnesses. But Traoré was not finished. I could go on for hours, he said steadily. I could tell you of the Dogon astronomers who charted Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes detected it, of the fractal geometry embedded in African art and architecture long before Mandelbrot described it, of the call and response tradition of African music that became the foundation of jazz, blues, rock, and nearly every form of popular music we know today. But I believe my point is clear. He paused, then delivered the blow. The question is not whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, do not know any of this. Or worse, he locked eyes with Harrington. Why you know, and choose to deny it. The theater held its breath, until one pair of hands began to clap. A young African woman in the third row. Then another joined. Within seconds, the hall erupted into thunderous applause. Students rose to their feet, then professors, and even some administrators. And then, the most remarkable moment of all. An elderly white professor in the front row stood, microphone in hand. Mr. President, she said, acknowledging Traoré's true title at last. It was Professor Mary Whitfield, head of African Studies. As a member of this institution, I offer you my deepest apology. Your words today have laid bare a shameful blind spot in our curriculum. I move that Oxford immediately review and revise its history programs to include the African contributions you have so powerfully outlined. The applause swelled again, louder than before. Harrington, stranded at the edge of the stage, looked frantically for support, but found none. His decades of authority had evaporated in 10 minutes. When the ovation finally subsided, Traoré spoke once more, his voice quiet yet carrying to the farthest corner of the hall. I do not seek apologies, he said. I seek truth. And the truth is this: human civilization is not the property of any one continent or race. It is the shared culmination of all human achievement, from the first mathematical notches on an African bone to the latest scientific breakthroughs of our time. But as long as professors like Dr. Harrington continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, ignorance and prejudice will endure. He rested his hand lightly on the lectern. Today, in this room, we face a choice: continue the lies, or embrace the full, rich, complex truth of our shared humanity. The hall erupted once more, not just in applause, but in a standing ovation that shook the very rafters of Oxford's Sheldonian Theatre. Traoré gathered his papers and stepped away from the lectern. As he passed Harrington, he paused. Professor, he said softly. Yet the microphones carried it across the hall. I've left copies of every source with your department. I trust you'll find time to read them. The applause still thundered as he returned to his seat. The aftermath was swift. Within hours, clips of Traoré's dismantling of Harrington's argument flooded social media. Headlines blazed across platforms. African President destroys Oxford Professor in historic debate. The most epic academic takedown ever filmed. But dawn, the videos had tens of millions of views. News networks picked it up. Scholars from universities across Africa chimed in, adding further examples to reinforce Traoré's points. The hashtag #FameAfricaBuiltCivilization trended worldwide. The very next day, Professor Harrington issued a terse statement announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Oxford University released a formal apology and pledged a full review of its history curriculum. Soon after, the Sheldonian Theatre, the site of the confrontation, was designated to host a new annual lecture on African contributions to global civilization. The first speaker would, fittingly, be President Ibrahim Traoré. But the most profound shift came not from institutions, but from students. Enrollments in African studies surged across the UK. Young historians began traveling to archives in Mali, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and beyond, unearthing manuscripts and knowledge long neglected. Timbuktu's libraries, the Dogon's astronomy, the surgical records of healers in Mali, all became subjects of renewed academic study. A year later, Oxford unveiled a new statue in its main quadrangle, not of Traoré, he declined the honor, but of Ahmed Baba al-Timbukti, the 16th century scholar whose 600 works on law, medicine, and philosophy rivaled anything in Europe of his time. The inscription beneath read, "Knowledge has no color. Wisdom has no continent. Truth belongs to all humanity." Years later, in an interview, Traoré reflected on that day. "I didn't arrive intending to give that speech," he admitted. But when Professor Harrington dismissed Africa's place in history, I thought of the children who might hear those words and believe them. I thought of the brilliant African minds erased from memory. I could not stay silent. He leaned forward, his tone quieter, yet heavy with conviction. The tragedy isn't what one professor said. It's that his views were acceptable for decades in a place devoted to truth. How many students sat through his lectures, absorbing lies? How many carried those prejudices into positions of power? That is why I spoke, not to humiliate him, but to break the cycle. When asked if his response had been too harsh, Traoré shook his head. For centuries, African history was written by those who enslaved, colonized, and exploited us. They had no reason to acknowledge our achievements. When you've been denied your history for so long, truth is not harsh. Truth is necessary. Harrington had 47 years to learn it. He chose ignorance. I chose not to let that ignorance stand unchallenged. What came to be known as the Traoré Moment is now studied in classrooms from Lagos to London, Cairo to Cape Town. It is taught not as a clash of egos, but as a turning point in academic discourse, a reminder that knowledge demands humility, curiosity, and the courage to challenge long-held assumptions. And in schools worldwide, when teachers open their lessons on human history, they begin with a truth that should never have been controversial. Africa is not just part of civilization. Africa is where civilization began. The silence that settled over Oxford that March afternoon did not mark the end of one professor's career. It marked the beginning of a long, overdue reckoning about whose stories are told, whose achievements are celebrated, and whose contributions shape the legacy of humankind.